Thank you very much, and thank you for all the presenters for the gracefully limitation of time used. We still have 20 minutes for questions and remarks. I want just to say that we finished with the land use, which is always the mother of all evils, if we talk about territory. But all the subjects are interesting. I only want to challenge a little bit the audience. How many people are not from ESPON here? Okay, they deprive us of that telephone mechanism, digital data flow, clouds, whatever is on the screen. But I would dare to challenge you, how did you manage to get into these bushes of acronyms, programs, sub-programs, sub-projects, former initiatives during the presentations? I mean, I'm challenging that because I think it's one of the subjects we should reflect upon, because obviously all the projects presented here are very important. And as more as we move to the big data, my irony was referring, it was slippery was the word, not sleepy, yeah? I'm remembering that big data is very useful, is very challenging. It's also Cambridge Analytica learned us commercially manipulative and political one. So I think it's very important how we let the message to pass beyond what is technical work of doing a study. And that's why I wanted to challenge, and maybe we reflect, and if there are questions, and then we come back eventually to that. Mr. Berescu, please. There will be... And if your question is general or is addressed to one of the speakers, you may...
It is addressed to one of the speakers.
Please.
Because besides the acronyms, I had a more stronger theoretical problem, like, what is rural to you? Because you address the urban-rural divide somehow, and it was described in a particular context with your coastal things. But there was not the rurals that I know. So how do you define rural, and how should we, because we are talking here about indicators and sort of homogeneous way to collect data and to interpret data and stuff. So, you know, rural.
Please. Someone has to be punished to answer this question. You do.
Is that working? Oh my God. All right, sorry. Okay, terrible question. Thank you. How do you define rural? When you're looking at rural from a UK perspective, which I know because I work in the UK, they tend to define it by population and by proximity. So they have blocks of 10,000 and they say, are you within this particular distance to it? That is problematic because when there's other sort of qualifications you can use around rural towns, rural spaces, urban spaces. We utilize, yes, we use the space-based and population-based definition of rural, but largely we allowed the stakeholders themselves, because we believed it was led by stakeholders, to give us their understanding of what they would consider to be rural, because we thought that was the most valuable way to get their feedback on it. But as you say, the problem is, what is rural? For some, rural is a house on a hill in the middle of nowhere. For others, rural was a market town with 500 other people. So it's very problematic. We allowed each of the stakeholders utilize...
You mean communities when you say stakeholders, or...?
Sorry, stakeholders in question here were... In the UK, it was a borough council, and in the others, it was largely municipalities. And they were then using their own national and regional definitions of what they would consider to be rural. And when we looked at the data and the data sets that we were using, they were all then defined on a national basis. But it's a very difficult question. I don't deny it for a second.
Yes, thank you. If there are any other questions? Or remarks, please. The microphone will come.
No, sorry. Your maps describe the situation of migration and unemployment in the Europe, but mainly in the south. And so I would like to know if you have information about the sectors and the policy sector where migrants are employment. And for sorry, if there is some document or policy addresses to relate the affordable housing in the city and the reaction of people, not only by income or other question, but with regard the policy needs and the development of a local, national, regional policy.
So, Zintis, you start first.
Thank you, Maria. And indeed, in the policy brief, we don't have information on the sectors. And this is merely because, as I mentioned, it's quite challenging to measure these things. Because normally what we use is two measures. It's either population change, where we also have, of course, the births and the deaths and also the migration, or just net migration. And these are the two measures where we have data and where we actually can see some regional breakdown. But when it comes to actually measuring employment of people who have migrated, it's very challenging. So the map I showed, I think that was the best I could actually get out of the databases. And I didn't look further regarding the sectors where the people end up. But I guess it might be possible, but it's quite challenging.
Yes, if I may rephrase the question, so you were wondering whether there are a set of documents for local action and policy implementation at local levels. There are many, but they are usually located within local planning agency and this kind of local activity in relation with housing. And this is an issue that we had beginning with this project at a European level. As far as we know, until now, comparison between housing markets are usually a matter of econometrics and a matter of benchmarking. And benchmarking between competitive markets, meaning how do you benchmark the cost of a two-bedroom apartment in Paris compared to the cost of a two-bedroom apartment in London, etc. This is benchmarking based on competitivity indicators. The idea of the study was to move away from this kind of indicators and to focus on affordability, which has not been studied in a wider European perspective yet.
Thank you. I will just want to add something referring to migration, and that I'm saying that because Romania has lost in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, 4 million inhabitants, which means almost 20% of its population, 10 formally, but 20%, 22% of its population. And it's not only the regions that are losing population, but there are also, and that it's related also to the size of what we call a region. It's the inner region migration, because there were cases where the undeveloped region lost rural population who migrated, not the urban population who remained in the cities. On the other hand, all Romanian large cities, I mean large cities about 150,000, about 100,000 inhabitants, all of them in the last 20 years lost between 10 and 25% of their population. So there are obviously different flows of migration. What strikes me, and I come to the very interesting presentation of Professor Davudi this morning, is that in 1982, when Spain and Portugal entered the, by that time, economic community of Europe, there were similar patterns of migration towards Central Europe, toward Northern, and there were some reverse flux after 10 or 15 years. Well, it seems that the countries didn't learn too much about policies for retaining migrants in their origin places, or doing local development policies, or improving that. And if we want to complicate more the picture, we have to take into account that the migration also generates, like in the case in Romania now, some need for labor force which starts to come from outside the EU. And that's another issue. I know it's politically sensitive because no one wants to speak about migration within EU, but that's also part of the arguments that are now, a little bit later, are used for discussing about social network at European scale, about discussing about VAT, having into account, as not to promote two more within EU competition, but to support and to take advantage of the chances of development, or on the contrary, to help the backlogged regions. And in the housing, I have just only one remark, because I noticed that there were, at the moment, Romania had no data there. But I know from the other housing studies, we are a country with 92 or 93% of ownership on housing stock, which somehow transformed the people owning a housing unit in a region which is lagging behind or is stagnant, from an opportunity into a trap. There is not the same American dynamic or British dynamic, because the rental sector is very small. So, and that was even more amplified by the fact that for until 5 years ago, the people who worked abroad still built houses in their regions which are stagnant. So they immobilized investments there. And now they decided not to come back in Romania or stay longer there, so the houses are depreciating. And if you look at the Romanian statistics in housing and censuses, we are pretty okay. We have 1 point something housing units for family, which does not mean we do not need social housing, or we have a lot of, and that's, it's related to housing statistics, related to market and Maria's question earlier, but it also shows a little bit how differentiated these problematics might come from one country to the other, or from one region to the other. If there are any questions, please. Tim.
Hi there. Thanks very much for those presentations. Just as a question for Roger and perhaps Renaud as well. Just keeping it focused on the question of functional urban areas and the variety of indicators that you're beginning to bring forward that, potentially for just at first glance present a very exciting picture of what might be observable across a different range of places that have similar characteristics, at least at first glance. Could you say a little bit more about what we might begin to learn if I get Renaud's implicit critique of competitive benchmarking, but if perhaps we limit it to comparative benchmarking, what might we learn about, for example, let's just say the top 20 or largest FUAs within Europe, on the range of indicators you were able to develop for this particular project, that we perhaps don't know already, and in what ways what can we expect in that sense, just to give us a kind of practical flavor of how to apply it? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question, but unfortunately our project is not meant to assess, let's say, the outcomes of that. So we are providing the tool for policymakers, for stakeholders, researchers, whoever wants to use it. We will provide the functionalities for benchmarking, comparison of indicators amongst functional regions, but we are not assessing at this stage the outcome. So unfortunately, I cannot give an answer to that.
Tim, thank you for putting the question. I didn't want to challenge the speaker on this subject, because that reminds me of a story of a signed beggar who started to broke nuts with the royal seal in a story of Oscar Wilde. It was Prince and Beggar, yeah? So, I mean, the tool might be very sophisticated and very well done, but I think it has to be, and I think it would be unavoidable for the author of the tool to challenge themselves of the shortcomings or traps that the tool application. For instance, I take the example of these border regions, 45 minutes and 90 minutes, I don't know. Where might be the pitfalls of applying the tools? or highlight it, because very often we had so sophisticated tools that we didn't bother to read the manual for using that. It's my case with my Apple Watch. I know nothing about it, so. Yeah, and we go there.
Yeah.
And we go there, yeah.
No, just let me add that it's true. I mean, the tool will be very powerful, and in this regard, it's good. But on the other hand, it's a bit dangerous because one needs to be aware that it's meant for estimation of indicators. So you have to think what an estimated indicator is. It's not actual data, it's estimated data. And afterwards, the difficult part is interpreting what you are getting
it's
from
not a
the
mechanical
tool.
model.
And for that, you need a lot of course, of inputs, not only from the tool, but knowledge on policies, and know why you are getting some results is the difficult part. But unfortunately, again, it's not our expertise, and it's not under our terms of reference, let's say.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to.
Yeah.
There was one more question, so remark. Yeah, but he'll also have to.
Yes, okay. No, I just wanted to respond to Tim and maybe help Roger, because we are together in this project, and ESPON is, of course, the one who ordered the project. I mean, the idea is that the tool will host data which we already have. If we go to Eurostat, let's say Urban Audit, or we go to GRC's Urban Data Platform, it will have this data as well. But the added value is that there's so much data which is not available, or there are large gaps in time series. So the aim of the project is to help disaggregate the data to have something at a functional scale. So that is what we see is the added value, and that, of course, then comes the interpretation issue, and that's of course also up to people who are going to use the tool. I think what we're going to do, we're going to provide them some guidance, and let's say how to use the tool, and like maybe also, look at some caveats and point out some caveats, but. Yeah, that's the main added value. If I can respond to like what to expect.
Very, very challenging question, but in 2 points. Of what we may want to learn. First, it's a reversal of a tactic, and we may learn something different about housing market and how they behave. The usual tactic is to explain price with the characteristics of the housing and the characteristic of the environment. This is the classical econometrical system. If we do not consider the price by itself, but how the price interacts with segregation, interacts with income distribution, interacts with many different urban settings, such as the core periphery system, I stressed the fact that many of the results were counterintuitive in terms of core periphery distribution. Maybe there is a way to challenge a little bit this view that a pricing system and a spatial distribution of the population is based on the sole core periphery system. And this is something very important because the mosaic, the social economic mosaic, is something very important, especially in very fragmented functional areas. When we think about suburbs, semi-rural areas, we had a question about what is rural, semi-rural areas. We may learn a lot of things while reversing the perspective, because the usual tools are based on central cities, mostly. So this is one thing. The other thing is that by decomposing the different problem in terms of affordability, but maybe debt to income ratio, maybe debt to price ratio, if somewhere the data exists. There are also ways to deconstruct how locally the market works in many functional urban areas, and how we may understand deprived areas compared to places where wealth accumulation is occurring. This morning there was reference to the work by Piketty. And housing markets are instrumental in wealth accumulation by households. So inequalities is twofold, deprived areas and wealth accumulation.
Thank you. The nightmare of any moderator is that there will be no questions, no reaction, and still time. We are on the opposite situation. We are out of time now. And don't imagine that I have too much authority because John left me notes here to announce, to keep in time. So what we'll do, we abruptly interrupt the discussion here, but again, I think it can continue, and I advise you to do that and to exploit our presenters. And there is a coffee break now, which is longer. It's until 15 minutes past 4, because in 8 minutes on the terrace, there will be a presentation of digital projects in Iași. So you have like 12 minutes, and then will be the presentation, and the coffee break still until 4:15, when in this hall the afternoon plenary session will start. So I thank you all the presenters. And thank you for assisting here, and okay, let's see what's further.